Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us in our complimentary webinar series for U.S. federal government contractors. We're coming to you live from Washington, D.C. today. You probably found out about today's webinar through our newsletter, which reaches over 23,000 federal government contractors and service providers. Today's session is complimentary and also recorded. You can find the recording on our website and YouTube channel about 24 hours after this webinar, though usually even sooner. And we have over 540 complimentary webinars on our YouTube channel. This includes all 52 parts of the FAR, all 52 parts of the DFARs, and hundreds of webinars on strategic and tactical topics. And a little bit more about us. We are a specialized consulting firm focused on working with established federal contractors. We work with product, service, and software firms across the globe. For more information about our services, please visit our website and select About Us. As mentioned, today's webinar covering the FAR supplements is complimentary and recorded. We began this series in January 2022, and you can find past recordings on our website. So here's just a look at what we've covered already. Today is actually the last webinar in our FAR supplements series. So we really encourage you to go on our website, view those past recordings. You can also find them on our YouTube channel, and then the slides and PowerPoints from every webinar are on slideshare.net. And here's a look at our Friday schedule. On Fridays, we cover the same agency or department in a playbook series. We've discussed upcoming bidding opportunities, contracting trends, small business resources, and we often feature a government speaker. So the last one again is this Friday, the 26th, and I encourage you to look at those past webinars. But we've added one more procurement playbook webinar, this time not on a Friday. It'll be Doing Business with NSA. This will be a live webinar only, and we're not recording it. The slides will not be available afterwards, so this is definitely a rare opportunity. We encourage you to participate. The government speaker will be taking audience questions during this webinar. This will be August 30th at 12 p.m. Eastern. And please join us for our specialty webinar series covering executive orders, House and Senate committees, and how they impact federal contractors. These are complimentary webinars that will be recorded. The registration links are on the slides, and they'll be sent to you after today's webinar. The first one is tomorrow. And then please join us for a special webinar covering cybersecurity compliance and enforcement. Our friends at Arnold & Porter LLP will be presenting in this webinar on September 30th at 12 p.m. Eastern. And then this fall, we will be starting a new webinar series covering subcontracting opportunities in the different government departments. These webinars will be on Wednesdays at 12 p.m. They begin September 7th with the Department of Agriculture. You can find the registration links and full schedule on our website under the subcontracting tab. And now we'd like to thank our sponsors who help make this webinar series possible. First, we'd like to thank the Virginia PTAC. The Virginia PTAC is based out of GMU in Fairfax and offers free one-on-one counseling to firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. If you're interested in learning more, please use the links provided to explore what PTACs can offer. And next, we'd like to thank the FBC. The Federal Business Council creates and manages virtual and in-person meetings and events to connect industry and government thought leaders, product providers, and solutions with government programs that use them. The FBC works with a variety of federal agencies to connect government and industry in the form of in-person and virtual conferences, training events, policy dialogue, and outreach. Over the last 40+ years, FBC has become a comprehensive resource for connecting industry and the federal government. Next, we'd like to thank Daston. Daston is an IT and cloud solutions provider working with corporations, the military, and government agencies to lower their costs, increase scalability, improve operational efficiency, and meet compliance regulations using targeted cloud-based solutions. DASN is a certified partner of Oracle NetSuite, a premier tier Google Cloud partner, and certified partner of Cisco, Virtue, AO Docs, and Authenticate. For more information about DASN services or to schedule a complimentary consultation, please email Jeff Alston or visit the DASN website. Next, we'd like to thank C3. C3 ISIT develops tailor-made technology solutions that increase efficiency, bolster productivity, and improve business processes. C3 is the leading provider of managed IT services, as well as compliant cybersecurity solutions for federal contractors. C3 works with defense contractors to achieve and maintain CMMC 2.0, DFARS, and NIST 800-171. Contact C3 to learn more about the CMMC 2.0 Readiness Program. The contact information is there on your screen now. Next, we'd like to thank Rlj Financial. Founded in 2008, Rlj Financial Consultants is a customer-focused, quality-driven, minority and locally owned provider of commercial insurance brokerage services. Their services are designed to maximize your return on investment in managing the risk to your business. Call Roderick today at 202-832-1417 for a free consultation and insurance quote. And lastly, we'd like to thank the PubK Group. The PubK Group publishes news and insights for government contractors, agencies, and counsel. Every day, PubK delivers news on bid protests, contract disputes, new laws and regulations, cybersecurity requirements, False Claims Act activity, and developments in mergers and acquisitions in the GovCon community. In daily news briefs and in-depth conversations and podcasts and webinars, PubK leverages its deep bench of government contract experts to keep you up to date on the fast-changing government rules and expectations. And every January, PubK presents its week-long annual review featuring more than 50 GovCon experts across a dozen panels, recapping the year's top developments. Participation and CLEs are free to subscribers. Visit PubK online at www.pubkgroup.com. All right, thank you again to our attendees and to our speaker for joining us today in our final installment in our FAR Supplement series. So today we're here to dig into the FAR Supplement on the Department of Veterans Affairs. And our speaker today is Matthew Moriarty, and he represents the firm Schoonover and Moriarty LLC. And as a reminder, we don't take any questions, so if you have any questions for Matthew, his contact information is there on the screen now. We'll also have it at the end of the presentation. You can contact him directly. So thank you, Matthew, for joining us today. I'll put myself on mute and let you take over.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to join you today. I am coming to you from our law firm outside of Kansas City in one of the suburbs. We represent clients across the United States. So I am more than happy to answer questions if you all have them. That's my email there on the screen and my direct line, so please feel free to reach out. We have a lot to cover today, so let's go ahead and get started. So this is kind of a summary of what I'm going to talk about today. We're talking about the VAR, V-A-A-R. It's the FAR supplement for the VA. I'm going to talk first about the basic structure of the VA in terms of procurement. Then the real meat of the VA, the VAR supplement, is the SDVOSB and VOSB rules. You're almost certainly aware of what those acronyms mean, but they mean service disabled, veteran-owned small business, and veteran-owned small business. Acronyms like that sort of tend to become second nature to us, just a word to us in this industry, but nevertheless, I always try to remember to say out what those alphabet soup collection of letters means. And then we'll end with just a few odds and ends that I thought were of some interest to our audience, pulled out from the VAR. So let's go to the next slide, please. So this is the basic structure of the VAR. One thing I did want to say is, and I appreciate being the last of the FAR supplement presentations. I hope that that's more of an honorary position rather than sort of being last to bat in baseball. I like to think this is a good way to bring it home. The great thing about the VA is that the VA is a cabinet level agency, and the VAR supplement does have some meat to it that we can sort of dig into. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So what is the VAR? And at its essence, it is a code of the federal it is part of the Code of Federal Regulations. You hear phrases like the FAR. The FAR is, in its totality, Title 48 of the Code of Regulations. So that's the Federal Acquisition Regulation System. The VAR, VAAR, is part of the Federal Acquisition Regulation System. It is Chapter 8, which is devoted to the Department of Veterans Affairs. Next slide, please. The VAR, and by the way, I tell people the VAR is kind of like, there's VAR in soccer, the referee that comes and tells you if you're offside. Well, VAR is like that, but just with a little bit of pirate attitude. It says VAR. The VAR and the FAR work together hand in hand. So these are not competing regulations. They are, it's a supplement, which is why it's called a FAR supplement. In the VAR, it says that FAR applies to all VA acquisitions except as provided in the VAR. So what the regulation is saying there is always default to the FAR when you are contracting with the VA, except for the rare instances where the VAR is different from the FAR, and we'll go through some of those. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give you sort of a lay of the land here. The procurement leadership group is within the Department of Veterans Affairs. At the top, you have your Chief Acquisition Officer, who is the Assistant Secretary for Management of the VA. Then you have your Senior Procurement Executive. The Senior Procurement Executive is below the Chief Acquisition Officer. However, that position may authorize deviations. We will talk a little bit about deviations. Deviations come about when, let's say, Congress, through its lawmaking, updates the law, and through that update, some of the regulations thereafter are out of compliance with the law. Not that they're totally adrift from the law, more like they're old now, and they need to be updated to reflect the latest changes. One of the ways they do that is by authorizing a deviation. A deviation is basically a agency-wide memo of sorts that indicates that contracting officers and procurement teams will use the deviation rather than the out-of-date FAR clause or VAR clause, VAR in this case. So that's your Senior Procurement Executive. The person who has the Senior Procurement Executive role is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Acquisition and Material Management. Okay, so that person who has that title is the one who serves as Senior Procurement Executive. Then you have your Deputy Senior Procurement Executive. This is the person who has the responsibility for ensuring that VAR clauses comply with FAR clauses, and the person may also authorize deviations. So there's Deputy Senior Procurement Executives who may authorize deviations, and there's Senior Procurement Executive, a Senior Procurement Executive who may authorize authorization. The Deputy Senior Procurement Executive is the Assistant Deputy Assistant Secretary for Acquisitions, an assistant. Nevertheless, you can tell that person has quite a bit to do in their job. Next slide, please. This isn't from the VAR. Nevertheless, I wanted to highlight this. You know pretty much what the VA does, right? The VA is there to assist veterans for the most part with their health care needs, their benefit needs moving forward. So the health component of it is split into VISNs, and you have, the N stands for networks. So you have a series of 21 networks where veterans can seek care. So these networks are often where you'll see procurement will be focused on, let's say, VISN 22. So you know, if you see a procurement focused on VISN 22, then you're going to have work in New Mexico, Arizona, and California. So that's kind of how that works. This comes from, again, not the VAR. This comes from va.gov, and you can look into that if you like. I have a source there on the slide. Next slide, please. This, again, also is not from the VAR, but this is, to me, it's important for you to have, as part of the basic part of this presentation, an idea of, this is about the, hey, if you're interested in the VAR, that means to me you're interested in doing business with the Department of Veteran Affairs. So it probably is good for you to know what type of stuff the Department of Veteran Affairs is buying. So here you have your, this says top 5. Obviously, there's more than 5. There's 9 here. I apologize for the error in the slide. Nevertheless, drugs, number 1. Drugs, pharmaceuticals, number 1. Medical equipment, number 2. Patient mobility devices. So you're talking about walkers. You're talking about crutches. You're talking about wheelchairs. Tests, clinical laboratory and analysis, staffing, medical lab testing and analysis services, in vitro diagnostics, dental equipment and supplies, x-ray equipment and supplies. We're talking about an agency that buys, for the most part, medical supplies and services. That's not all the VA buys. The VA buys all the other services as well. You know, someone has to be in charge of the parking at these facilities. Someone has to be in charge of the trash at these facilities. But this gives you a good idea of what the VA is focused on. Again, this is coming from 2018. That's the most up-to-date numbers that I could find. And it's from Doing Business with the VA, a publication actually put out by the VA. Let's move on. Now we're going to get into what I consider to be sort of the meat of the VAR, your special rules associated with SDVOSBs and VOSBs. Currently, the VA is the only government agency that recognizes the status of VOSB. That means veteran-owned small business. There is a government-wide SBA recognition of service-disabled veteran-owned small business. And so that means you may be doing SDVOSB work for the Department of Transportation, the Department of Defense. You might be doing, you know, SDVOSB work for the Forest Service. All of that is wonderful, but if you're simply VOSB, so you don't have the service disabled component of that status, then the only place that you're going to be doing VOSB work currently is for the VA. Next slide. So the VAR establishes, VAR 819.201 that the VA is to establish goals each fiscal year for contracting with SDVOSBs and VOSBs. Now, the Secretary of the Department of Veteran Affairs has the authority to decrease the other government-wide goals within the VA to benefit SDVOSBs and VOSBs upon consultation with the SBA. You'll find that the VA and the SBA are more and more working hand in hand with regard to these programs. And in fact, I read an article today that said that by January 1st of next year, the Center for Verification and Evaluation, which is the VA's center that verifies VOSB and SDVOSB status, will be fully transported over to the SBA. So that's coming up. It shouldn't change the day-to-day too much, but it is a rather big change. Back to the point of this slide. So the VA's focus, as it should be, is on veteran-owned small businesses. And that means that if the 8A goal, for example, is getting in the way of work to SDVOSBs and VOSBs, then the Secretary of the Department of Veteran Affairs has the authority to decrease that 8A goal and therefore hopefully steer more work to SDVOSBs and VOSBs. Next slide, please. This is just a little bit of background. VAR 819.7001 tells us that the SDVOSB program and VOSB program are a creature of statute. That means that they came from Congress, created by the Veterans Benefits Healthcare and Information Technology Act of 2006. So that created the program for small businesses owned and controlled by service-disabled veterans. The purpose of creating this program, of course, is to provide contracting assistance to SDVOSBs and VOSBs. The mechanisms of doing that are that goal that we talked about before, and well, primarily the goal we talked about before, and a thing called the Rule of Two, which we'll talk about soon. Next slide, please. Eligibility is currently governed by the SBA's regulations, which you can find at 13 CFR section 125.8 through 125.13, and the FAR. I can give you a real brief elevator pitch of what it means to be SDVOSB and VOSB. Basically, it's 51% owned and controlled by veteran or service-disabled veteran. Where the rubber meets the road on that is not necessarily the ownership. Ownership is at 51%. That's usually pretty easy to understand, although it can get a little complicated because ownership must be direct. That means you can't own through a shell company or anything like that. The veteran has to have that ownership directly held by the flesh and blood human being. But really where the rubber meets the road is that control element. The veteran cannot cede too much control to non-veterans and still maintain SDVOSB or VOSB eligibility according to the SBA's regulations. It used to be that the VA had a full set of regulations and the SBA had a full set of regulations defining what these terms mean. They were similar, but with some key differences. Those regulations have all been combined now under the auspices of the SBA. However, eligibility according to the VAR, it still says except where expressly directed otherwise by the VAR. And there are some components of that such as the good character component is a VAR requirement that is not required by the SBA. Good character means that, basically to be an SDVOSB or VOSB, the veteran must have not been convicted of a felony, things of that sort. So the VAR instructs that in order to be eligible as an SDVOSB, by submitting an offer on a project that is SDVOSB or VOSB set aside, we'll talk a little bit about set asides in a minute. The concern submitting the offer is making a promise to the government that it is one SDVOSB or VOSB to a small business under the NAICS code assigned to this specific procurement and verified SDVOSB or VOSB by the VA VIP database. Once you get, so the process goes, you submit an application. Currently, the process is you submit an application to the Department of Veteran Affairs Center for Verification and Evaluation, that's CVE. Once CVE verifies that the entity is an SDVOSB or a VOSB, then it publishes that entity's information in a publicly available database called the VIP database. You can reach it. It's a VetBiz. I don't want to say exactly what the website is because I think I might be misremembering the exact website, but I think it's vetbiz.gov. If you Google VetBiz VIP database, you'll find it. Next slide, please. So briefly, as with most statuses, SDVOSB, VOSB is eligible. A joint venture can have that status assigned to it. A joint venture may be, according to the VAR, by the way, you still have to comply with the SBA's joint venture regulations and any other joint venture regulations, but a joint venture may be considered an SDVOSB or a VOSB concern if at least one of the members of the joint venture, that means one of the company entities that is a member of the joint venture, is SDVOSB or VOSB, and each member is small under the relevant size standard according to the NAICS code assigned to that procurement. The joint venture also must meet the requirements of paragraph 7 of the size standard explanation of affiliates in FAR 19.101. By the way, FAR 19.101 has since been not repealed, but it has been reserved. So that means that it no longer has text that applies to it. But what they're talking about here meets the requirements of paragraph 7. What they're talking about here is having affiliates and understanding that if you have affiliates, your size is combined together. So let's say I own a company A and my father owns a company B. Because we're closely related, we're considered to be likely affiliates. That means that in the eyes of the government, company A and company B are actually one and the same, call it company AB. So that means that the joint venture has to meet those affiliate, it has to still be small given those affiliate explanations in the FAR. If you have questions about that, send me an email. I understand it can be a little bit complicated. The concept of affiliation is actually probably something that can have its own presentation because it's very dense. Last but not least, joint venture has to meet the requirements of 13 CFR 125.15, and that is the regulation that says what a joint venture agreement must look like. There are a number of specific requirements that must go into the joint venture agreement, including, what bank account you have, who's going to sign for payments from the joint venture account, who's going to, are you promising to do the work share that is required, et cetera, et cetera. So the VAR does recognize joint venture eligibility for SDVOSB and VOSB. It relies on the rules of the FAR, and when you see 13 CFR, that means SBA. So it relies on the FAR and the SBA regulations to explain how to go about making sure that you're eligible as a service disabled or a veteran-owned small business concerned for joint venture eligibility status. Next slide, please. I promised we would get to the rule of two. This is probably the #1 mechanism that ensures that veteran-owned and service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses are #1 in priority when it comes to the VA. So this rule says that a contracting officer shall set aside an acquisition for SDVOSBs and VOSBs upon a reasonable expectation that offers will be received from 2 or more eligible veteran-owned businesses. Award will be made at a fair and reasonable price. So the rule of two does not apply if there are 2 veteran or service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses, but they are going to charge more than is reasonable to the government. I highlighted the word shall for you because shall, when it appears in a regulation or a statute, it carries a connotation with it that is mandatory. So shall as opposed to may or might or can. Shall is it's a requirement that these contracts be set aside if there is a reasonable expectation that 2 or more entities that are SDVOSB or VOSB will bid on the project, and that they will offer a fair and reasonable price. Interestingly, if there is the expectation that 2 or more will bid, and by the way, that is done through market research and various other techniques, including the history of the procurement. If there is an expectation that you will receive 2 offers, but that's not what happens in reality. In reality, only 1 offer is received. That's okay. If it's a fair and reasonable price, the contracting officer should award that contract on the basis of that 1 offer received. If there are no offers, then the set aside will be withdrawn, and the contracting officer should consider, not shall consider, the order of priority. We'll talk about the order of priority in a second. So next slide, please. So for veteran-owned small business set-asides, there's a very clear priority. It's 1, 2. SDVOSBs have priority over VOSBs. And this applies to every VA contract, including a purchase from the Federal Supply Schedule and including an indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contract. I'm assuming everybody here on this presentation knows what FSS and IDIQ means, but just for the record, means Federal Supply Schedule, which is GSA, General Services Administration, contract to buy, certain items, and usually commercial contracting vehicle where basically the government is saying, I don't know when and how much of what I need, but I know I'm going to need it. So here we're going to have a standing contract that allows me to order these supplies, whatever I want, over, generally speaking, a 5-year period. So the instructions of the rule of 2 are, if your SDVOSB set aside and you do not receive any SDVOSB offers, then you move to priority 2, which is veteran-owned small business. That's pretty clear. Let's move on to the next slide. This is about sole source awards. I do think I come back to priority later on in this presentation, so we're going to talk about some of the other programs that are out there, 8A, WOSB, stuff like that, but not right now. Right now, we're still focused on the SDVOSB and the VOSB program. The VAR does permit sole source awards to SDVOSBs and VOSBs. The contracting officer has the discretion to award sole source awards when certain conditions are met. Number 1, this is not going to be a more than $5 million contract. Number 2, the requirement is publicized according to FAR Part 5, so that means no sole source contracts without complying with the publication rules of FAR Part 5. And number 3 is the SDVOSB or VOSB, I should have said or VOSB here, is a responsible contractor. Responsible in shorthand means that the contractor is capable of doing the work. So that's obviously a key component of a sole source contract. Normally speaking, the act of competition helps establish that your awardee is going to be responsible. Nevertheless, since there's no competition in a sole source award, it's important that the awardee be determined to be responsible. Finally, that award can be made at a fair and reasonable price. That's the same concept we just spoke about. Next slide, please. A little bit more about sole source awards. They do have to be supported by a J&A, and that means a justification and approval document according to the requirements of the FAR. Basically, what that means is the contracting officer has to justify the decision to give this award without competition. In simplified acquisitions, a sole source award may be awarded first to an SDVOSB or second to a VOSB. Simplified acquisitions are less than $250,000 for the most part. There's some exceptions there, but we don't need to go into that right now. If we're talking about above the simplified acquisition threshold, then the same priority applies that we've talked about before. Concern has to be responsible, award cannot exceed $5 million, and award can be made at a fair and reasonable price. Next slide, please. So, SDVOSB or a VOSB can remain that status after the decease or the death of the veteran in certain circumstances. I just wanted to highlight this so you know about it. This comes from the definition component of the VAR. So what happens when the veteran dies is the veteran's spouse acquires the ownership rights in the business upon the veteran's death. That means that the business is no longer owned by a veteran. However, it can be treated, the spouse can be treated as though they are the veteran for status purposes until the surviving spouse remarries or relinquishes ownership, or 10 years pass, or the business grows to be a large business. So essentially, the spouse acquires ownership rights, and they can keep that status for up to 10 years unless some other circumstances are met. Now, there is an important caveat. In order to be treated as the veteran must have had either a 100% service-connected disability rating or to have died as a direct result of their disability. There's a lot of talk now about burn pits and things of that sort. I wonder, if a veteran died of a complication that was part of being exposed, part of this disability, whether they would be considered to have died as a direct result of that disability. And how do you prove that? Do you get a letter from your doctor? Is it incumbent upon you, the surviving spouse, to hire a lawyer and go about proving right away that this death was a result of the disability? I don't know the answer to those questions. It's something that's still up in the air, but I just wanted to highlight it for you. Let's move to the next slide. The VAR also recognizes that some of these entities will either not be eligible or will lose their eligibility during the course of time. And for that reason, competitors are permitted to protest the size, the status of the SDVOSB or VOSB concern. In fact, the reason why I corrected my error there, misspeaking, is that if you do want to protest the size of a SDVOSB or a VOSB, that is an SBA. In fact, the SBA has the sole authority to determine a concerned size. So a size protest has to go to the SBA. VOSB or SDVOSB protests, by the way, can go to the SBA. There is a CVE status protest available currently at the SBA. It goes to, in fact, the SBA Office of Hearings and Appeals, which is an administrative judge. However, the VAR recognizes a different procedure currently, and that's what we're talking about here. So who can bring a VAR-based status protest? Well, the contracting officer or an interested party may bring a protest of the apparent successful offer status. The protest requirements are simple. The protest must be in writing, and it must state specific grounds to support a finding that the entity is not SDVOSB or VOSB. The turnaround is relatively quick. When the announcement is made of the presumed awardee, that starts the clock, and you have 5 business days to protest that status. So if that announcement is made on a Tuesday, day 1 is Wednesday, day 2 is Thursday, day 3 is Friday. Then you skip the weekend and you have day 4 is Monday, day 5 is Tuesday. Okay, so when we're counting these days, we're not counting calendar days, we're counting business days. A status protest, the way you file a status protest is you send it to the contracting officer. The contracting officer then has a mandate that they must forward the protest to the director for the Center for Verification and Evaluation, CVE. We talked about that. The director will issue a decision within 21 days. Next slide, please. There is an appeal process within the VA. The protester or the protested concern may appeal the director's decision. Those appeals go to the Executive Director of the Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization, OSDBU, OSBU. That appeal, again, would be due within 5 business days. I should have pointed out before, federal holidays are not business days. So if you did the counting we did before, but that Monday is President's Day, well, then you don't include that day. So the 4th day would be Tuesday and the 5th day would be Wednesday. In order to appeal, the requirements are pretty simple. The appeal must be in writing, and it must include a statement as to why the decision was a clear error of fact or law. It's pretty simple. What's the difference between fact or law? Well, fact would be you applied, you thought I was one business, but I'm a different business. That's an error of fact. An error of law is you applied the wrong law. You were supposed to apply, VOSB standard. You applied a SDVOSB standard. That's an error of law. Okay. So if you do appeal, again, a protest, you get a decision within 21 days. An appeal, you get a decision within 10 days. Next slide. Lastly, on SDVOSB, VOSB is that, they're not all contracts are going to go to an SDVOSB or a VOSB. Nevertheless, if they go to a large prime, chances are there's going to be a subcontracting plan requirements. The VAR says any subcontracting plan must include a VOSB, SDVOSB goal that is at least as high as the VA's prime SDVOSB or VOSB goal. So let's say the VA has a 10% goal, and I apologize, I don't know exactly what the VA's goal is right now off the top of my head. But if it's, let's say it's 10%, that means that the subcontracting plan must be at least 10%. It could be more, it could be 15%, but it has to be at least 10. So the Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization will review all subcontracting plan achievement reports, and if a subcontractor is actually declared ineligible, the prime can appeal that decision to the Executive Director of the Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization and to the Center for Verification and Evaluation. Appeal here is due within 5 quote-unquote working days. Working days are the same thing as business days. Working means it's not a weekend or a holiday. Decision will come out if there's an appeal within 5 working days, and the appellant can actually appeal that appeal to the Senior Procurement Executive. We talked about the Senior Procurement Executive. That's right at the top of the VA procurement pyramid. If you're a prime and you appeal your appeal to the SPE, that would be due in 5 days, and you'd get a decision in 15 days. Next slide, please. That is all we have on SDVOSB and VOSB. Now, I have a few slides that are just interesting slides, and I hope that you'll get something out of them. Next slide, please. So we talked about priority previously when we were talking about SDVOSB and VOSB priority and the rule of 2. There is more to that. So the rule of 2 is a rule that says if the rule of 2 is met, the VA has to set this work aside for SDVOSBs and VOSBs. But what if the rule of 2 is not met? We talked about there's not enough SDVOSBs. That means you move down to number 2, VOSBs. But VAR 819.7004 says after VOSBs, the contracting officer shall consider the following order of priority. Next would be 8A, business development concerns. So the SBA has an 8A program for socially and economically disadvantaged entities. The 8A program is a very successful program for various reasons that we don't need to get into here. But if you're contracting with the VA and there are not enough SDVOSBs or VOSBs, then your next stop on the possible set-aside lineup should be 8A, followed by Hubzone. Hubzone is the historically underutilized business zone program. That means you have an area of town that has not been historically not been utilized for business. A contractor places their business in that area and hires people who also happen to live, enough of the staff, 35% of the staff happens to live in a hub zone, then that entity can become hub zone certified. We don't need to go into the specifics of these programs, but just know that if SDVOSB and VOSB set-asides won't work, there is an order of precedence after that that should be used. 8A followed by Hubzone, then finally followed by any other small business contracting program. In this case, the only other one really that it could be is woman-owned small business or economically disadvantaged woman-owned small business, or small business set-aside itself. Next slide, please. Speaking of small business set-asides, the VAR allows for total small business set-asides and partial small business set-asides. So the VAR gives contracting officers the authority to apply a small business set-aside to all or a portion of a solicitation. That decision can be appealed according to VAR 819.705. An interested party may challenge a set-aside decision. What does it mean in this case to be an interested party? Well, that's a prospective bidder who would be eligible for the work, but for the decision made. So let's say you're not a small business, but you're interested in a certain work. The contracting officer decides that the portion of the work that you're interested in is going to be set aside for small businesses. Well, then you have the opportunity to challenge that set aside decision within 5 working days. That means business days, not including weekends and holidays. And if that decision does not go your way, you can appeal to the head contracting authority. So that's right at the top of the pyramid that we talked about before. Next slide, please. You may be aware of the Certificate of Competency program. The Certificate of Competency program is an SBA program. The VAR simply, its role in this is explaining how when the VA and the SBA disagree on a Certificate of Competency, then who's going to be in charge of resolving those differences. The long and short of the Certificate of Competency program is we talked about what it means to be a responsible contractor. If you're a small business and you're in line for award, but the contracting officer makes a conclusion that you're non-responsible for this work, the contracting officer has a duty then to ask the SBA to concur, and I don't want to say to concur, that's actually wrong, has a duty to refer the matter to the SBA so the SBA can investigate the small business's actual capability and determine whether the small business should be issued a Certificate of Competency. The Certificate of Competency goes from the SBA to the VA, and it says either the SBA has, well, if you get a certificate, then that means the SBA has determined that you are responsible. So maybe the VA doesn't agree with the SBA. So there is a VA liaison who is the director of the Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization. The VA does not have much role in this, but does have it will be kept in the loop, because the certificate of competency packet will be copied to the VA liaison, the director of the OSDBU, and the VA can appeal that decision, but before appealing, the VA head of contracting authority has to talk to the director and seek the director's concurrence in that. So that's how the VA interacts with the SBA and the Certificate of Competency program. Next slide, please. We talked about deviations. The VAR describes the procedure for getting a deviation from a regulation that is out of date or otherwise needs to be deviated from. What happens is the contracting officer submits a request to deviate to the head contracting authority or the deputy senior procurement executive. The request has to state the reasons why the deviation is being requested and what specifically the deviation is going to be. The deputy, we talked about who has the authority to issue deviations earlier, but basically they will authorize the deviation if it is in the best interest of the government. These authorizations have to be later included in the contract file or the purchase order, and they can be for individual contracts or they can be class deviations. So the deputy can say, by issuing a class deviation, they're saying, okay, this deviation applies to all procurements from here on out, when it's in the best interest of the government. Next slide, please. So this is just something that, to me, this is just kind of something that contractors should know about. The VAR prohibits contractors from mentioning that they have VA contracts in advertisements in a manner that states or implies that the government approves or endorses the product or service, and or the government considers it superior to other products or services. So let's say this, if you were the manufacturer of a stent, so like a vascular stent that goes into the body and keeps veins and arteries from contracting. If you were to then, and you sell that to the VA, if you were to then put out an advertisement and say, we sell this to the VA and the VA agrees, we must have the best. That's why else would they buy it? That's contrary to the VAR. So that's something to just be aware of, because to me, it sounds like something that a marketing component of a business might think would be a good idea, when it's very much not a good idea. Next slide. The VA has an advocate for competition. So if you're worried about the VA not competing work that you think needs to be competed, well, there are advocates that you can reach out to. There actually is a list of advocates on the VA's website. I put the link right there. But generally speaking, you're going to be talking about the Associate Executive Director of the Office of Procurement Policy Systems and Oversight. That person can appoint procurement advocates for competition. And those advocates are available if you search on the website provided. That's just another thing that can be used to hopefully help advocate for competition and for small business access to this work. Next slide, please. All right, so this is my last one. Again, this is a kind of an insight into how the VA works. So let's say the VA is going to buy supplies, or let's say the VA needs supplies. How does it go about obtaining those supplies? Well, the first thing it should do is it should find out whether it has an inventory of those supplies, or another agency has an inventory of those supplies that can be used. Then, if that's not the case, it should look to see if there's a national committed use contract awarded by the VA National Acquisition Center. So basically a mandatory contract that must be used. If that's not the case, then look to the FSS contracts awarded by the VA National Acquisition Center. If that's not the case, then you go to national blanket purchase agreements, other blanket purchase agreements, or other Federal Supply Schedule contracts. Finally, there are IDIQ contracts, which are standing contracts for indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity, that can be purchased. Supplies can be purchased off, or there are open market purchases. As you can see, before you get to an open market purchase, there's actually quite a bit of looking around to see if there's a source for these supplies already in place. Next slide is our final slide. Thank you for joining me. Again, I'm more than happy to answer questions. Shoot me an email.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for such a great presentation. As he said, there's his contact information on the screen should you have any questions. And the recording from today's webinar will be available on our website and YouTube channel in less than 24 hours. And the slides will be available on slideshare.net. We hope to see you on Friday when we go through the playbook for the Department of Veterans Affairs. And we'll also have a special guest from FedBiz, which I know Matthew mentioned today. So I really hope that you can all make it. This concludes the webinar. Thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your day.